So Adrian, you've written this wonderful book, Body Language in Business, with your co-author, Eugenia Petrova. Is that how you pronounce it? Evgenia Petrova. Now you're an academic psychologist, you're a professor of psychology, you do research in psychology. What attracted you to the idea of writing a book on body language in business?
Well, a number of reasons. I did my doctorate in Oxford and I worked with two really rather famous people in this area. One was Michael Argyll and the other was Desmond Morris. And they were very interested in this topic and I've always been interested. But also I do some consultancy work in business. And so when you go out into the real world and try to work with managers and that sort of thing, you notice how lacking in perception some of these people are. They're unable to read the signals and they're not very good communicators. And so I started using these ideas in my training and teaching of these people, and then thought, well, it's about time I wrote a book on the topic. So that's how it began.
And it's very interesting you mention your consultancy work with finance, because there's some ideas around in psychology that different personality types are attracted to different areas of work, so that engineers are likely to be different kinds of people to salespeople, let's say. And there is a theory, I think, that the people who are attracted to finance and excel at finance may not be good at things, at certain skills, emotional skills, to do with picking up body language.
Absolutely. I think it's called ACER theory. It stands for attraction, selection, and attrition. You're attracted to finance because of your personality, because of your interests, because of your values. They select you because you look as if you're right. And if you don't fit in, you leave. It's called attrition. And I think what these people are, they tend to be very, very cerebral, very analytical. They are hypothetically deductive in their thinking. So they like bridge, they like chess, they like numbers, and they like it to see the pattern. And they're not very intuitive. And what they've often done is they've avoided people because of their training. They've gone into engineering and maths and done MBAs. And they've been very, very technically, analytically clever. But when they come to managing others or persuading others, it's not their world at all, because people have emotions. They're not as logical as machines. People weep, people scream, and they don't know what causes this. Now that's an extreme case. But it's they're not very emotionally literate. And you can teach them how to become more emotionally literate, and starting with, in fact, body language is a good way to begin into this sort of training.
So in business, a lot of things happen between people, like communication, negotiation, and you go into many of these different areas. But you're saying that an increased knowledge of body language, an increased understanding of it, an increased awareness of it can help you in many different areas of business life.
Yes, I think it generalizes. You know, people will go on a presentation skills course and they'll go on a negotiation skills course and they'll go on an interviewing skills course. And guess what? All of the courses have body language components. Are you able to read your audience? Are you able to read the person you're negotiating with? Are you able to read the signs that the interviewee is giving you? The better you are at doing this, the better you become a practitioner of one sort or another.
So there's negotiation, there's going to job interviews, there's career success, how to succeed in office politics. You also mention that in the book. There's the sales situation, how to sell. And there's also persuasion, which is a huge part of the psychology of business.
Oh yes, you'll notice if you ever go into a car sales room, for instance, how very carefully that people have choreographed the whole setting. They know about nonverbal communication. They know when you should be sitting down and standing up, when you should be touching things and not touching things. And they're well taught to do this. All salespeople will be very, very skillful observers of others, and they'll be looking for little signs of anxiety or interest, because they're going to use them to their own advantage.
But there'll be many people who will be skeptical about body language. They'll be in bookshops, they'll see lots of best-selling books which offer you the world if you can read body language. They might offer you a better life, they might offer you that you'll be able to date Jennifer Aniston if you can read her body language. So some people are skeptical about the claims made about body language, but your book is different in that it's very rooted in research literature.
Yes, I think there are a number of sort of myths regarding body language. There's two or three that you hear again and again and again. The first one is everything is symbolic. Now, I always say to people, do you know of a very famous person, when you see him in public, what he'll be doing is fiddling with his cufflinks. Who is this person? Who is this famous person? And about 1 in 10 will get it. It's Prince Charles. Prince Charles is noticeably a cufflink fiddler. Now, he fiddles with his cufflinks. Well, that's because he's slightly anxious, no doubt, at the time. but people have said, oh, this is a manifestation of his feeling that he's handcuffed to the monarchy. Well, I think that's amusing, but quite a lot of nonsense. Occasionally you see people in an interview fiddling around with their wedding ring, and this is the idea, oh, I'm unhappy with my marriage at the moment. Well, maybe not, but there is far too much emphasis on the idea that everything is symbolic. Every small thing you do symbolizes something else. I think this is the ghost of Freud. The other myth that you hear a great deal is this idea of the power of body language, that people, you'll see the statistic, and it derives from a paper by a man called Morabian, done in the 1970s. I have read this paper very carefully. And he came up with a statistic which showed that 70% of the information that's conveyed is non-verbal and 20% verbal, and the rest is not important. And people have said, this is the power of body language. It's much more important in communication than what you say. It's how you say it is more important than what you say. Well, if that was the case, why would you learn Chinese? Why would you learn French? Just do it. And of course it's a nonsense. In that particular study, it was a study on the mismatch between verbal and non-verbal, and the way in which you will read somebody's what they're saying. So if you're talking to me, and I see you saying some emotional talk, and you look as if you're not experiencing those emotions, which one am I likely to back? Well, of course I'm likely to back the emotion you are showing me, not the emotion you're talking about. In that unusual circumstance, and it's even more unusual because of the experiments, that yes, under those circumstances, body language is much more powerful. But on a daily basis, we communicate by a language. We communicate very in detailed ways and very, very clearly by language. Yes, the non-verbals colour it a great deal. And I think too many people make too much business of that the power of non-verbal communication is such that if you can't read this, you'll never be able to read anything. And as you say, you can have better relationships with people. I think it's good to be perceptive, but these are exaggerated.
So one of the pitfalls is the tendency to make Freudian overinterpretations from a particular piece of behaviour. So the example you've given of Prince Charles fiddling with his cufflinks, there's a Freudian interpretation that it shows that he feels handcuffed to his job and doesn't really want to be doing that job. So that's one of the pitfalls.
Yes.
Another pitfall is not to contextualise, because I think it's one of the key points you're making in the book. In other words, there's some information you're getting from body language, but you need to contextualise it from all the other information you're getting from the verbal communication and so on that's happening.
Yes, absolutely. The situation in which, how formal is the situation? What are the requirements of the behaviour? I saw an article recently complaining about this woman, and she was sat in a particular way with her legs very tightly tucked under the chair, and this article said this was a sign of some sort of sexual repression. Well, it was obvious to me that the seat she was sitting on, the dress she was wearing, this was the sign of her modesty rather than anything else. It had nothing to do with that. And you'll find other people, neuro-linguistic programmers, are very, very keen on saying that if you look to the left and if you look up and if you look at this, it means various things. Well, it might or it might not. The data show that this not to be the case a lot of the time, that where you look is a function of a lot of things. It's a function of the room you're in, it's a function of your personal habits, it's a function of what's interesting around you. So the overinterpretation is amusing, it sells newspapers, but it's not scientifically based a lot of the time.
And a lot of your book is helping people with the process of what to look for and then how to use that information. And the bottom line point, because we're going to go on and talk in more detail about each chapter of the book, is that emotion is very important in business. People bring an emotional state, they're motivated, and what we're trying to do in business is work out what the other person's emotional state is, what's driving them, and that's crucial to successful business strategy. But the kind of person attracted to finance tends to be good with numbers, may not be so good with the whole arena of emotion.
Yes. I think the development of what is called now emotional science has really taken off. We are people of the head and people of the heart. And what we have neglected for a long time is the idea that these two are connected. Indeed, your emotions are as likely to drive your head as your head your heart. And of course, in the world of business, particularly in the world of finance, we are trained at university and at school to be analytical, to be logical. Maths is stressed all the time, and so it should be. But of course, what this means frequently is that people have neglected the whole role of emotion in business. That is why I think the whole topic of emotional intelligence has become so enormously popular. People will say, if you ask people, you say, well, would you like your boss to be high on emotional intelligence and low on intellectual intelligence, or the other way around? You'll be surprised. They want both, of course, but they're much more likely to trade off emotional intelligence for cognitive ability. Both are extremely important, but it's us beginning to realize the importance of emotion, the importance of being emotionally literate, of me being able to read your emotions, indeed my own emotions, to make the whole nature of our relationship much more profound and much more successful.
And just to finish off that point about what you mean by emotional literacy, you mean an ability, first of all, to understand your own emotional state.
Yes.
An ability to understand another person's emotional state, but also an ability to, maybe it's the wrong word, but to manipulate or to have an impact.
I would use manage.
Okay.
So am I currently aware of what emotional state I'm in at the moment? Am I able to, if I'm in a state I don't want to be in, can I do something about it? Can I manage it? If I'm a bit anxious, if I'm a bit concerned about something, am I able to calm myself down? Equally, am I able to read you? And if I see you're in an emotional state I don't think is very happy or healthy, am I able to change your emotional state? So it's awareness, self and others, management, self and others. Simple idea, very important in business.
Could you tell us a little bit about any, and you may have to disguise the details to protect confidentiality, of examples in your consultancy work where you've noticed issues that arose in terms of some people's deficits in management of others, and how an improved knowledge about body language or an improved knowledge of emotional literacy made an impact or made a difference to them?
Yes, I'll give you a case of a man I was coaching. He was a moderately senior executive, and he had a reputation for being cold and arrogant and unhelpful. And when I met him, none of these things struck me at all. And it soon became apparent that what he was not good at doing, he wasn't very good at small talk. He didn't have any understanding of how to work a cocktail party. Now, he was quite good in business and analytical meetings because he knew how to drive this and drive that. But he was not very good at this very, very simple stuff. And of course, when he went to these situations, he froze, got rather sort of cold, was rather dismissive of individuals. And once you talked him through and taught him and showed him what is required, how you break into a group, how you begin to negotiate and start the small talk, it changed his reputation over 5 or 6 months. And this liberated him. He was a talented man, but he had this, in a sense, of block. He didn't know what to do with this, and he treated everything as if it was a business negotiation. Once he realized it was not like that, and he could read people and do the appropriate small talk, it liberated him enormously.
And what's really interesting is a point you make in the book in that context, which is that intelligence is not something that psychologists generally believe you can really do that much about. Whereas emotional intelligence is something you can do something about. You can learn these skills, you can improve them, and they can make a vast difference to your career.
Some people will learn faster than others. Some people will go further than others, indeed. But I think, yes, we do believe that intelligence is not very manipulable. There's no courses I know of called Learn to Become Brighter, Be Smarter. You can do your Sudoku and so forth, but it's not going to make a significant effect. However, one can do something. One can teach you the skills. One can teach you the behavior repertoire, and that will make a significant difference. And you can see people move. You can see them change. It's very satisfying, very gratifying, both for you and for them.
So let's go on and talk in a little bit more detail about what's in the book.
Okay.
So Adrian, in your book, which is all about body language in business, the title is Body Language in Business, you start off by explaining that body language is not something as superficial as we might think it is. It's actually quite biologically inbuilt into our bodies and our brains. For example, newborn infants begin to demonstrate consistent pieces of body language, which suggests then it's hardwired into our brains and bodies.
Yes, there are other evidence of hardwiredness. For instance, babies born blind will smile in exactly the same way as sighted children, and they will show exactly the same facial expressions. In other words, these are somehow coming out, but they're not learned. We know that if you take identical twins separated at birth and brought up in different environments, indeed different cultures, they will show surprisingly large number of similar patterns of nonverbal behavior, suggesting a significant genetic component. On the other hand, of course, we do know that some non-verbal behaviours are particularly learnt. You only have to travel to different countries in the world. The Italians are great people of the gestures. They have about 35 useful gestures. A famous one, which is el dente, on the tooth. It means that food was wonderful, whereas we don't have that gesture. Eye contact patterns in Japan or in China are different from ours. So there are ways in which we know that these things are learnt, that there is a learning component, but there is also this important genetic component, that there is in our makeup reasons for us to show emotions in a particular way, that when very, very upset, all people will cry. When very, very angry, all people will snarl in a particular way. That's hardwired.
And that's important as well, the hardwiring element to it. And you also produce some other evidence. For example, primates, apes and monkeys show a range of body language behaviours that are not dissimilar to what human beings do.
You only have to go to the zoo and go walk up to an orangutan, walk up to a gorilla, and you can interact with them. They will mimic you, and you can mimic them. It's surprising. They will smile. If you twitch your ear, they'll twitch theirs. It's an amazing experience, showing the extent to which we have very similar behaviours to other primates.
And there's also cross-cultural research that indicates that certain body language behaviours are universal across the planet.
Yes, yes. Most of the books tell you the opposite. They will, they make a lot of how people will use their gestures in different ways. Let me give you one example. The movement of the head. Well, you can move it in this plane, or you can move it in that plane, or you can do the famous Indian head wobble. Now, for most of us, this is yes, and that is no. But in the Balkans, that is no, and this is yes. So they use the head in one plane. We tend to use it in two planes, some cultures in three planes. So you can, by and large, get away with this is yes, and that is no anywhere in the world, with few exceptions.
So one of the fascinating bits in the book is where you explain where we tend to make an error about how much information is communicated via body language as opposed to words, or straightforward verbal communication. And this dates back to some research done by a respectable body language expert, but the results got misinterpreted, again because people weren't thinking about the context in which people were focusing on body language.
Yes. A very famous man called Albert Mehrabian, who wrote a number of books in the 1960s when this research started going. And what you tend to do, if you want to try and look at the effect of the power of one set of variables or factors over another, is make them contradictory. It's quite fun with children. You know how there's a game with children, you have smiley eyes and smiley faces, and you match them up, you give them cards and you match them up, and they can do that quite well. But what happens if you take smiley eyes and a non-smiley mouth and put them together and say, what is the emotion, children? They at a very early age, they can't do that. They're unable to describe the emotion. I think it was the emotion that our last Prime Minister might have had. But what Mehrabian was trying to do was to say, if you present people with stimuli, in other words, they are shown a video of somebody, and this person is saying that they are very calm or very, very happy, and they look as if they're not, they're sweating, they're shaking or whatever, then under these circumstances, you can change the verbals, how they say it, what they say, the verbals of what they say, the vocals of how they say it, and the visuals of their non-verbal behaviour. So we can vary all three. And that's what he did. He varied how they said it, what they said, and how they looked when they were saying it. Well, of course, if you show people this, and you see someone obviously distressed, who are saying that they're not distressed, you and I would know that they are, from personal experience, that they are distressed, because we can't help showing this some of the time. It's our automatic nervous system clicking in. And he showed in this study, then he calculated the power, the amount of variance of these three things: the words, the sounds, and the body language. And in this particular study, I think it was about 60%, or maybe even higher, was attributable to the body language, much less to the vocal things, and even less to what they were saying. And that made sense in that particular study, in that particular context. It's about people showing emotions that are different from what they're talking about. Well, as soon as you get those numbers, people jumped on this. And I have been to presentation after presentation where up comes the slide. 70% of the communication is is done by nonverbal communication. That's why it's so important. Well, the caveat is 70% of the nonverbal communication in situations where it's contradictory to the vocal cues and where it's all about anxiety, then that is true. But we don't get that. And that's where you get this hyper, this is where you get, I think, people saying things which is patently not true. They want to sell books, they want to sell courses, and they overegg the pudding.
And you nail that point by saying, of course, if it was really possible that we could communicate 70% of the time without language, you could go to China, not speaking Chinese, and just use body language, you should get on fine. So it's a good example of where grandiose claims are made in other, less well-researched books.
In our culture we have a game called charades, and that's exactly what the game is. The game is you don't use words, and you show a film or a play or a book or something, and you have to guess what it is. And it's very difficult, it's huge fun, it's a party game. And you can see how good some people are at charades, both interpreting and showing. It's a party game which shows the lack of power of body language, not the other way around.
But let's go back to Mehrabian's research, because it takes us to a very important point you make later in the book, which is that when you're analysing someone and you're looking at their body language, you want to check out the wider context. You want to look at what they're saying, what emotion they're communicating via various channels, like the content of the words, but then does it match up with the tone of voice, their facial expression, with the rest of the body language. And when things don't add up, when they don't fit in, that's when body language can become really important in providing one of the words you use in the book, leakage, about something maybe going on that the person communicating doesn't want you to know about, or for various reasons isn't being entirely forthright about.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that always people will do when they're trying to detect whether a person is being honest or not is get a shot of the whole body. Now, we are quite sophisticated torso liars. We're quite good from here up, but our feet tend to wobble a lot when we're anxious. All the emotion comes down, and it's the leakage. You're pulling your nose at that particular point, you see, would be a very classic gesture, which would be associated with lying or discomfort, because what you're doing is you're covering the mouth. You're not touching your nose, you're covering the mouth, because out of the mouth are coming things that you don't really want to say. Now, what happens when people are uncomfortable and lying, it doesn't necessarily have to be lying, but when they're trying to hide something, is that they are, the tension that they feel, because most people are uncomfortable with lying, but not everybody, comes out in some way. And that's where they leak. They leak through their hands, they leak through the voice, they make mistakes. The body, the parts of the body they don't think people notice move. And there is where the information comes. So it's this disparity between what they look like, what they say, and their movement. And then you think, aha, something's going on. Let's investigate further.
And the point you make about the restless foot is very interesting, because what you're saying is if the upper body looks calm and someone's trying to communicate calmness to you or conviction in what they're saying, but the lower part of their body is fidgeting, then the further away you are from the head, the more difficult it is sometimes to control that, and there may be leakage of information occurring there.
Absolutely. Always get a person on a bar stool. You get them on a bar stool, you see the whole body and you see the movements. That is the best way to see what's really going on when they're tense, because of this way in which they leak various ways. The bar stool would be particularly good because of the movements of discomfort, the leg movements and so forth, yes.
But when you talk about putting it all together, you're not just referring to the whole body, you also talk about the face, for example.
Yes.
It's the upper part of the face matching the lower part of the face. And you talk about this more in the chapter on deception. But for example, a smile, and we're going to talk in a little bit about different aspects of body language in more detail, but a smile can be just the lower part of the face and not involve the upper part of the face, but your smile now involves both aspects. And you're saying that tells us the difference between a genuine smile, a felt smile, as opposed to a smile that's just meant for public consumption.
Yes, yes. And if you look at very famous people like Lady Diana, she had a number of quite different smiles. Our last Prime Minister, Mr. Brown, had a lot of difficulty with this, and it was very obvious for those of us who study the television, was that he's been told quite clearly that he has to smile more. And he knows that a smile, like a child, a smile is that. It's the smile at the bottom part of the face. And you can see from the eyes, you can see from the creases, if you study it frame by frame, he's not smiling at all. He's simply moving his mouth in a particular way. There's none of the laughter. Now, he's a man who wasn't very prone to it. Occasionally he would. It's very obvious the distinction between the genuine open, giving smile, and this pursed, demanding, required smile, which he put on, I think to his ultimate disadvantage. I think people didn't trust him because he tried to express emotions he didn't feel.
And you develop this point later on in the book, particularly in the chapter on deception, but a smile can have multiple meanings. So it's a mistake to assume that because someone's smiling, it must mean one thing as opposed to another. So they're different kind of smile, they have different meanings, and again, you've got to contextualize it, you've got to put it within the background. But the other important point you make is gather information all the time about the person you're trying to analyze. Don't just rely on a snapshot. The more information you've gathered and see the context in which they tend to smile and manifest certain kinds of smile, that's valuable information.
Yes. We call it base rate, and the idea is what are people like when they're behaving normally? I'm somebody who moves rather a lot, I talk quickly. Does that mean that I'm fidgety? Does it mean I'm nervous? No, that's me. That's what you get when you deal with me. Now when I deal with somebody else, they might have a different base rate. They might be very still. They might not smile a great deal. What you need to know is what they look like and what they sound like when they are normal, happy, not being concerned about anything. Because what you're interested in is when that behavior changes. When suddenly there's a high incidence of smiling, there's a high incidence of twitching. They suddenly speak much quicker, they suddenly speak much slower. Aha, what's going on? Doesn't mean they're lying necessarily, but it means something's different, something's affecting them. What is that? And you're picking it up by looking at them and listening to them.
So what's fascinating about that is, although there's lots of data in the book about what different gestures, for example, might mean, you're kind of arguing, I think, that you should approach people when you're trying to analyze their body language with few assumptions, but make as few assumptions as possible, because after all, this particular gesture could be something to do with the person's personality. It doesn't mean that it indicates they're lying, for example.
Absolutely.
So approach with few assumptions, but also notice changes in particular. Not just what someone habitually does, but when they stop doing it, what does that change mean?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things you see mimics, and we like mimics, and what mimics will do, the brilliant ones, will look very, very carefully for a long period of time at a particular person, maybe a film star, maybe a politician, and they will note their funny little gestures, their funny little twitches or whatever. And of course they will accentuate them, and you can recognize immediately a famous person by some twitch, by some movement that is characteristic of them. That doesn't mean anything, it just means that that is their idiosyncratic particular type of behavior. What's interesting is when that increases or goes away, then there's something interesting. So yes, go into the situation you're in, it's going to affect your nonverbal communication and your behavior, and so is your particular idiosyncratic pattern. Once I know how the situation affects you, once I know your funny little ways, then, and only then, can I begin to interpret it appropriately.
So just before we move on to the next chapter, I want to focus on a very important point you make, key I think to business, which is you're saying pay more attention to the particular channel of communication that the person you're dealing with has chosen. Have they chosen to communicate to you by email, by phone? Do they want a face-to-face meeting? Is it an embossed letterhead on the letter? They've sent you a formal letter? Because these different choices of channels of communication can be revealing. And you should choose carefully which channel you pick. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yes, indeed. I mean, why people talk about the paper trail, and what lawyers want is they want the paper trail. They want the record of the words. And of course, when you put things on paper, it gives you more time. And most of all, you can delay the feedback. So what you'll find in a typical interview is the successful candidates will be phoned up and told, well done, you got the job, and the unsuccessful candidates will be sent a letter because it's easier it's easier not to receive that type of feedback. Now there are efficiency and cost efficient times where you would send letters. But of course what I think is most fascinating is the whole world of emoticons. Somebody showed me an app the other day of something like 40 or 50 emoticons that you can send. What's an emoticon? An emoticon are these funny little smiley faces that you put in text. Because text is so cold, and you might put a smiley face to indicate that actually it's a joke you're making, actually you're being sarcastic, which you can much easily do vocally or visually than you could by a letter. So people choose to write the written text, and sometimes again you can do that in a rather pretentious way. Look at the way people will send Christmas cards, if they still do, that they have a message. The iconography, the letter-headed paper, the prestigious address gives information along with the words. It's a colder medium, it's a record. It can be tooled, it can be adjusted, it can be made deliberately ambiguous. All these are options. Then of course you can communicate with people verbally, or vocally rather, that you can talk to them on the telephone, or you can you can Skype them. Then you have the accent, you have the voice, you have the speed, you have all the intonation. Now what's interesting is the extent to which people can't tell things. You know, can you tell the age of somebody from their voice? The answer is between the ages of about 20 and 70, no. Can you tell the sex of somebody from their voice? Well, not all the time. We've all made errors in that regard. But the voice will give you other information, sometimes misleading information. So in some cultures, an accent will have indications of education. A northern accent, a Mexican accent, will be received differently than a received English accent, than a posh accent. So the information is overlaying the words. And then, of course, you can communicate with people face to face. Now, I know we'll talk about this in a minute, but if you say to people, I want you to judge whether somebody is possibly lying, would you prefer to see them face to face, or would you prefer to talk to them on the telephone? Under which circumstance do you think that you are more likely to get an accurate answer? And they 99% will say face to face. Well, they're nearly always wrong. And there are experiments which have shown this, because what people are doing, they're misreading the cues. Actually, if they listen to people speak, there is enough cues in the listening. And sometimes I will do experiments with students. So I'll say to somebody, I'll get them forward in a room, and they'll stand there in front of people, and I will ask them questions. They don't know what the questions are, but they know they have to lie to some and not lie to others. And I say to the people, do you think you're going to get this? Maybe you do 4 of these. 2 are lies and 2 are accurate. Some of the people, I say, close your eyes. Do it with your eyes closed. Well, the ones who do it with their eyes closed are as accurate as the people who are seeing, because they get put off by things. Because we think that lying, everything is much more detectable visually. Whereas if you listen carefully, there are a number of cues there. So to answer your question, you can write to people on email, old-fashioned letters. You can talk to people on the telephone, and you can see people either face-to-face or on television or Skyping. And you've got verbal cues plus vocal cues plus visual cues. And they add up. The really interesting thing is where they don't fit together. Or where one set of cues, the fact that you're wearing an outlandish outfit, or you've got a big tattoo or something, one cue overpowers all the other information you're getting. And that makes a lot of people not very accurate, not very sensitive in picking up the information that they're getting.
So one important point you're making there is beware of the fact that in too rich stimulus environment you can get distracted.
Yes.
And that in fact might be part of the reason why people
Yes.
are choosing to overload you with stimulus.
Absolutely.
So we're going to come on to talking later on about the fact that you should be more focused and pick on things like gaze,
Yes.
and maybe focus on that and then focus on a smile and think about that and so on. We'll come back to that in a minute. So there's a distraction problem, which you've referred to, which is in a way where body language can actually distract you. But
Yeah.
you're also saying, think carefully about the channel of communication the person you're dealing with in business has chosen to deal with you with. Why have they chosen to write you a letter as opposed to call you? Because that could be very revealing.
Absolutely. And they might want to put it on record. And indeed, I was speaking to somebody just the other day that they were having problems with their manager, and it was about the appraisal. And he then, as a colleague of mine, started sending emails. He started sending emails so that he could keep a record of what this person was saying to him. So he switched from face-to-face to email for very deliberate reasons.
And that switch was key.
And that switch was key because he was going to use that in evidence.
Yes. And that betrayed something that was going on that
Yes.
the person
Yes.
may not have otherwise have noticed.
Yes. And of course, that's why it's very interesting when somebody suddenly asks you to send me a letter or confirm this in writing. It means something very different often than the gentleman's agreement, the handshake. It's not quite the handshake when it's on an email.
But in your book, I think you're also saying that you should think about where you're at your best in terms of communication and persuasion. I'm reminded of one of my favourite films, Jerry Maguire, which is a film where Tom Cruise plays a very, very manipulative sports agent who's famous for being able to get elite athletes to sign with a sports agency. And he has this wonderful line where he says, I'm the king of the living room. I'm best in the living room. They send me in there. And now for the first time I realise what that line means. Because of his use of body language and his personality, he's much better at convincing people to sign the contract when he visits them in their living room than by email or by phone. And you're kind of making that point.
Yes. And you see it, I mean, go to a car showroom. They're very interesting places. What you'll find in a car showroom is there'll be a desk, there'll be a place to sit. There might be a place where you have coffee, and then there's the car, and you'll be taken around because in these different bits of the room and these different situations, you will have different conversations. I can remember my PhD supervisor in his rather large and grand office. You were seated. There were a number of options where you could sit. You could sit opposite him, next to him, on a couch. And it depended on the nature of your relationship. When I was a PhD student, I sat in a particular place. When I was his research assistant, I sat in a particular place. When I was his colleague, I sat in a particular place. Because the situation facilitated the nature of the interaction. And so that is quite important. That in houses, all houses have associations. The front room has a different association than the dining room, has a different association than the bedroom. And people will behave differently. A very famous sociologist called Goffman made this point, and you notice it in hotels. You'll see the swing doors and the staff will come out and their behaviour will change immediately from one posture to another because it's front of house as opposed to back of house. Their behaviour, their talk, their physical nature, everything is different in the one setting as opposed to the other, just inches apart.
And another point you're making, which is kind of like beyond body language, which is to observe not just someone's body language, but the context, the environment in which they practice business. What does their office look like? Where are the front stage areas, the backstage areas where people are more likely to be themselves? And the interpretations you can make about the structure of the organization, the hierarchical nature, how authoritarian it is, from what you can observe about the way people work, the environment in which they work.
Yeah, the desk being the barrier. You know, where do you sit? Now, doctors, I'm sure you will know, will sit people on the side of the desk rather than opposite them. Furthermore, a number will have chairs with wheels on them. And the whole point of the chairs with wheels is that you can move around while staying at the same height. Because if I stand up, it changes the nature of our interaction. Height is always very symbolic. In Oxford, there's high table. Well, high table is only 6 inches above the other table, but the height is important and symbolic. And so you'll find that doctors will move around the room at the same level on a chair with wheels so they can examine you and come back without this change. That is deliberate. That is good medicine because what it's trying to do is convey the nature of the relationship between people because these things can make a difference. And of course, watch people in the waiting room and watch them in the surgery. They don't behave the same. They might be much more defensive. And some doctors will be very, very careful about watching where people start rubbing. You know, what's the nature of the pain you experience? Well, is it a throbbing pain? Is it that sort of pain? And because they don't have the pain words, they will start using the gestures to emphasize these things quite differently at home to their spouse as opposed to in the surgery.
You make a very interesting point about some interesting research looking at the fact that in restaurants where people are seated opposite each other, they tend to leave the restaurant more quickly and not have a longer meal than if they're not seated in that manner. So seating positioning is very interesting and actually can influence the dialogue and the outcome of the relationship.
Dramatically. If you, the question is, if you're running a restaurant, what should the shape of the tables be? What do people like most of all? Number one, they like a round table or a table roundish, because then you have the option of sitting at the angle we're sitting at now. That's quite a good angle because it allows us to move away and back. If you're sitting at a restaurant, a typical restaurant that might have tables where you have to sit opposite each other, you will notice when women go for a meal, they'll often sit next to each other, whereas men will always sit opposite each other. And sometimes when they're partners, they will sit next to. Now, it's quite an interesting issue. The same is, of course, true with negotiations, the physical nature of the negotiations. It was Churchill who said, "We shape our buildings and afterwards they shape us." Look at the House of Commons. Look at the way in which you've got red team versus blue team and the way in which that becomes adversarial as opposed to other situations where it's not that shape at all. The shape of the room, the way in which the furniture is arranged influences the nonverbal behaviour, which influences the interpretation, which influences the whole interaction.
Let's now talk about the chapter where you pick on particular aspects of body language in great detail and analyse what they mean. So let's talk a little bit about gaze, for example. You're saying that what people look at, how long they look at it for, when two people are attracted to each other, how long they look at each other, how long they hold the gaze, is quite revealing. So what people are looking at, and also changes in gaze behaviour, seems to be extremely important.
There's been a couple of books written on Nothing Else But. It was
Nothing But Gaze.
Nothing But Gaze. There's one famous book called Gaze and Mutual Gaze. And it's a book, a whole range of experiments on looking. It was thought at first to be utterly trivial and utterly random. Of course, it's not at all. Let me give you 3 examples. First of all, why do people wear dark glasses? They wear dark glasses sometimes because it's very, very sunny. But they wear dark glasses for a number of, sometimes they're a fashion statement. But the point is that I can't see your eyes. Why do blind people wear dark glasses? Blind people wear dark glasses for a very particular reason. They wear the dark glasses because they cannot look at you. When we interact, it's very important that I look at you to know when it's my turn to talk, what I'm talking about. When I'm stopping the conversation, I can see from your eye gaze behaviour. Blind people wear dark glasses because they can't see where you are, and that you assume if I'm looking there as opposed to looking at you, it's very discouraging from your point of view. It's very difficult. So they wear dark glasses to hide their eyes. Now, why would some people wear reflecting dark glasses, these mirrored glasses? It's a particular type of preference for supposedly American traffic cops and so forth. And the answer is, when I look at you, I'm trying to get information of where you are looking. I can't see your eyes, but whereas I can see my eyes. So it gives me what is called objective self-awareness. It's very off-putting. It's difficult talking to you in dark glasses. It's much more important talking to you in reflecting dark glasses, because what I want to see is where you are looking and when you're looking. That's one of the important factors of gaze, that you know when you're handing over the conversation. If I stand too close to you, if you go into what Americans call an elevator and we call a lift, we're having a jolly conversation outside the lift. As soon as we walk in, we turn around and look at the numbers. Why? Because we're too close now. It's uncomfortable. The only way we can distance ourselves and to make the eye contact pattern normal is that. So the gaze is a function of distance. It's also a function of the topic of the conversation. I say to people, can they think of 2 situations where 2 professionals are, a person is going to see a professional about an issue. In the same room, they're going to be quite close to each other, but they can't see each other. What are the 2 situations you can think of where you are going to see somebody to talk to them in the same room, but you can't see them? Well, the Catholics among them will recognize the confessional, and of course you would recognize the old famous psychiatric couch. The psychiatric couch and the confessional, in fact, are very similar conversations. They're conversations about problems, they're conversations about worries, they're conversations about anxieties. So why would it be that you don't want to see the person? Why is it that you try and get the patient or the confessee not to see you, to make it easier for them to talk? Because the more the topic of the conversation is an embarrassing one, the more you want to look away. So let's make it easy for you. So therefore you can't see me. I can sense you being there, but you're not there, because the topic of the conversation influences the eye gaze pattern. So if you stop the eye gaze patterns. I'll give you one other example, a very famous case of walking in the woods. Men will often do this, and I've seen this done when coaching people. Sometimes people like to go for a walk. One of the advantages of going for a walk is not having eye contact. You're close to somebody, you're walking, you're on the same path, literally, but you can't see each other. And then the conversations can be more intimate. So when and where and how much you look is infused with information. It's a fascinating topic. I'll give you one more example, and that is a very, very famous study published in the great journal Nature on Mrs. Thatcher and turn-taking. And the paper was entitled, "Why is Mrs. Thatcher interrupted so often?" And what would happen would be, if you watched, politicians want to talk in an interview, the more airtime they have, the better. And they also frequently don't want to answer the question. But what happened to her was the interviewers would interrupt her again and again and again. And it came across as her being very dominant or wanting to talk too much at the time. No, it wasn't that at all. If you studied it very carefully, what she did was she handed over the conversation to you non-verbally. I'm going to stop and you're going to start. And we do it partly through eye gaze. And what she would do, she would hand over the conch, but then not stop. In other words, she was giving the wrong signal. And people picked up the signal, an eye gaze signal. Okay, you're finished, I can start. They started when she hadn't finished. So it looked as if she was being interrupted. all through eye gaze.
And eye gaze can also communicate something about personality. More dominant people have different patterns of eye gaze compared to others.
Absolutely. It's you stare somebody out. I can remember years ago, it was huge fun at school with teachers. If a teacher moved across the room, what you would do is when the teacher was on the one side of the room, you'd smile, be attentive, look, and the other side of you, you'd yawn, not pay attention. And what you could do is you could shape their behaviour. They didn't know why, but they were spending more time on the room where you were more positive than others. Now, some people will be much better. You will watch the stare of the lion, the way in which you can intimidate people through looking at them. This comes more easily to socially confident people, to extroverts who feel able, not necessarily to be dominant, but more comfortable in these situations. We know that when you are not confident, that you look away, that you turn your eye gaze. And introverts are much, one of the ways in which people will interpret a person's personality are through their eye gaze patterns. The discomfort of the introvert, looking away all day.
One final point I want to just bring up on eye gaze, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about it later, which is deception. And there's a common misunderstanding. Most people think that the way you pick up deception in someone else, or whether someone's lying to you, is that they look away and that they are fidgety and shifty in their look. Whereas in fact the evidence is, and that you talk a little bit about it in the book, that in fact liars, particularly accomplished liars, are more likely to hold your gaze for a bit longer.
Yes.
Partly what's going on there is they're monitoring you to see how the lie is going over.
Yes, but they also make a mistake because they do it too much. And the issue is there's an optimal amount of gaze. There's too little indicates frequently, or people think it indicates discomfort and lying. And then there's too much. And it's as if I'm so confident or trying to persuade you so much that I look at you continuously. And that's why sometimes, you can catch liars through their dominant gaze. They're trying too hard to persuade you it's truthful.
Okay, we talked a bit already about smile and the fact that smiles can mean different things, but there also is a link between smiling and deception as well, apparently.
Yes, ventriloquists always smile because it's easier to talk with like that. And what people are taught, if they are taught to be liars, is that smiling is always the best thing to do. Why? For two reasons. One of which is if people are smiling, then they seem much more confident, much more relaxed, and you associate people who are lying with anxiety. And also, it makes the person themselves feel good. There is evidence to suggest that if you smile, this has an impact on you, a reasonably open smile. So it's a good way of hiding your emotions and a good way of foxing other people. So you will see, particularly with salespeople, a high incidence of smiling behavior. They're able to hide their dislike of you, and they're able to make you feel comfortable through the smile. Always watch ventriloquists as well.
But smiling is also, when you mention this in the book, kind of more profoundly important because it can actually change your own mood.
Yes.
So experiments that are done where people have to hold a pencil in their mouth, which creates a kind of smile, although they're not feeling more cheerful, it actually has an impact on their mood. So the smiling comes first, and then that can influence your mood.
Yes.
And also that can change the mood of people that are with you. So you can actually have a profound emotional impact on other people through smiling.
If you go to people running presentation skills courses, one of the first things they will do, particularly if they come from a more dramatic background, is start you off by how you stand and how you look for the first moment or two. So you stand very still, very quietly, and you smile. And the smile is good for them, and it's good for you. And the smiling is part of it, and the encouragement early on particularly of the comfort, that you give yourself comfort and you give them comfort, that what's coming is going to be enjoyable.
So let's talk a little bit now about the chapter on everyday signs and signals. And this is about general appearance. And again, the evidence is very interesting in the book that before you even get to body language and gestures and the way people are looking, their appearance, how fat they are, how tall they are, how short they are, seems to have a profound impact on impression formation.
Indeed. It's called shapeism. And the idea is that people will react to you according to your shape. Well, whether you like it or not, they do. We know the characteristics of an attractive woman from a man's perspective. I can tell you the measurements. And then in terms of 3 ratios, one is called BMI, body mass index. It's about weight versus height. And the answer is about 20, 21, 22, somewhere around there. The next is the waist to hip ratio. It's the waist versus the hip. That should be about 0.7. It's associated with youth and it's associated with fecundity. And the next is the leg to torso ratio. So long legs and a shorter torso in women. It's the opposite way in men. So you can say, I can design what was a person in terms of their statistics, which would be attractive to a woman, attractive to a man. And so there are these ratios. We also know in the face, what is an attractive face? Well, one of the most important things is symmetry. You're looking for a symmetrical face. You're looking for bigger eyes, a smaller nose. There's a masculine chin. Now, movie directors know all about this. Painters know all about this. And what people are doing with makeup or with plastic surgery is to change those features to make themselves look more attractive and to make themselves look more confident. So we can define attractiveness visually without much difficulty. We can design a beautiful face. That's what plastic surgeons do. They change the nature of the face to make it more optimal.
But what is also more surprising is the fact that people make deductions about your personality, about your intelligence, from your shape and your appearance. And that a lot of people wouldn't realise. It's very important to be aware of that in terms of impression formation in the business environment.
Yes, you see, thin lips mean that they're insincere, or a big nose mean that they are untrustworthy, or wearing spectacles mean that you are a intellectual, that sort of thing. Again, movie directors will know about this because they'll make their character look, you'll see a certain individual and you were told he could only play the role of the bad guy. He was a bad guy. He looked like a bad guy. He couldn't play the good guy role just because of the way he looked, because of the association. Now, he might have been, in true life, and a particularly nice person, but we have associations of thick eyebrows, heavy lips, or whatever, and they're associated with sexuality, they're associated with meanness, they're associated with duplicity, a whole range of these things. And you can see old-fashioned books, indeed, where they will look at criminology. There are wonderful books of the 19th century where you can see from the head and the nose and the ears of an individual that they are criminals. It's nonsense, of course, but it was believed then and still to some extent believed today.
Again, let's just briefly talk before we move on to another chapter about colour, because colour is very interesting. The choice of colour people have in terms of what they might wear seems to be quite revealing about personality, and there are also some quite profound and interesting gender differences in terms of colour preferences.
There are. It's a literature which interests a lot of people. The work suggests that the effects are quite small. It's definitely the case, and designers will do this, and there are colour consultants, that your skin colour, that it affects, that some colours look better on you than others. Some people say you look washed out in particular colours, or red suits you very well. You'll know, for instance, them with redheads of a particular skin texture. And silver works better on them than gold, and they can't work with various colours. And you can see when a colour consultant will go to an individual that they'll very noticeably change their wardrobe, and this will have a beneficial effect. But as you say, there's also some preference for colours. Extroverts will tend to use more saturated colours, more brighter colours, colours that attract the attention of others, whereas introverts will do the opposite. There's one other factor, and that is, of course, the association of colours in various cultures. So in China, the brides will get married in red. White is a sign of death. White is a bad colour. Indeed, if you go to funerals, that you used to be required to wear black, because black is symbolic of death and mourning. Whereas now, sometimes people say, no, now wear white, because white is more symbolic of hope. So there is a symbolism of colours as well as preferences for colours. But some people will be very, very strong in their particular preference, and it might come from it might come from their values. But you do in a small way pick up information about people's colour preferences.
And I love this paragraph here, which says extroverts tend to prefer arousing warm colours, such as red, while introverts prefer cool, calming colours, for example, green. Extroverts choose and prefer bright, pure colours, whereas introverts prefer more subtle shades. Sensation seekers prefer red, while sensation avoiders prefer blue.
Yes.
So you can pick up quite a lot about people's personality from colour.
Yes, not too much. I think there are other factors as well. We know We know that the way in which people will interact in a room, you can change people's perception of heat and cold. There's a very famous study where you got people in a rather overheated room and told them they could adjust the temperature of the room, and you could measure to what extent they adjusted it. And the room was in cool colours as opposed to the room being in hot colours. Well, they turned the temperature up to warm the room more when the room was in a cold colour, not when the temperature of the room was that particular. It's a small effect, but it's not. It is one indicator. It's an easy indicator to fool people with. In other words, if I want to come over as an extrovert, I'll start simply wearing very, very bright colours, and it's easy to fool people on that.
One of the reasons why many books on body language aren't that helpful is that you need a background framework with which to understand people. And psychologists have famously divided people into personality types. You can be an extrovert or an introvert, neurotic, stable, and there are other personality types we're going to talk about. But that's usually quite an important basis that you need, really, in terms of understanding people, on which to apply the body language data. And that's a deficit in many other books, unlike yours. So tell us a little bit about what an extrovert is, and what an introvert is, and what a neurotic is, and how that's useful in terms of how to deal with those people.
Extroversion is, I think, often misunderstood. People know what an extrovert looks like. If I say, is your mother an introvert or an extrovert, they can very, very easily classify people along these dimensions. I think what people don't understand about extroversion is its essential nature. I always say to people, have you heard of ADHD? Attention Deficit Hyperactive Syndrome. Yes, they've heard of it. And these people are often given a drug. The drug is called Ritalin. It's a very well-known drug. Is that drug a stimulant or a depressant? And most people think it would be a depressant. In fact, as you know, it's a stimulant. So why are you giving a stimulant to these people who can't sit up and sit down? And the answer is they are seeking stimulation. Now that's what an extrovert is like. An extrovert is somebody who is more comfortable, more aroused, more excited, more active, more focused when there's stimulation around them. And they can have stimulation of many sorts. You can take coffee is a stimulant. But of course other people are a stimulant. And why extroverts go into sales and marketing and these sort of jobs is that they are comfortable around other people. They like the stimulation levels that this provides for them. This means, of course, that extroverts are less distracted in open-planned offices because because there's need for some sort of stimulation. It means also that when they've been very much younger, they've been more comfortable around people. They have moved towards people as opposed to away from people. And that the more experience they've had of people, by and large, the more comfortable they are around. That is why we're thought of them as socially confident, socially comfortable. Now, there are some disadvantages of being an extrovert. Extroverts trade off accuracy for speed. They're more likely to have accidents. They're more likely to make mistakes. They're more likely to get themselves into tangles in relationships because they will have multiple relationships for excitement. But by and large, what the extrovert is somebody who is seeking stimulation levels, and they're attracted to jobs and other people who give them that sort of stimulation. They tend to be more socially confident, they tend to be more optimistic, they tend to be more happy. It's associated with happiness. If you say in a room of people, you say, point to the person who's most extroverted, they'll all say him. Never ask them to point to the introvert, because the assumption is that there's something wrong with introverts. That's not true at all. It's simply that they are understimulated. They don't need all this sort of stuff. But we have in our view this idea of there's something wrong with the sad introvert. Now, if you go into the world of business, what you'll notice, to your surprise, or to other people's surprise sometimes, is the extent to which some very successful leaders are introverts. But they are what we call socialized introverts. In other words, they learn to look like an extrovert. They've got to go around, shake hands, kiss babies, smile, do all the things that easily come to extroverts. What happens is that introverts feel more exhausted. They go home at the end of the day tired, because in a sense they're acting, they're looking like somebody they're not. But the requirement is to be outgoing, sociable, talkative, all the things you associate with extroverts. Now, one more thing, of course, it's not introverts or extroverts. There are dimensions. You can have an extreme extrovert. And an extreme extrovert, and you can think of some examples of this, might do very well in certain occupations. They might do very, very well on the stage. They might have some hint of hysteric personality disorder. They might be a bit overly emotional at times. And then, of course, you will have extreme introverts, people who don't like going out, spend all of their time alone. Most of us are in the middle, we're ambiverts. But it's a very, very important dimension. It is very predictive of behaviour in the workplace. But the other one you mentioned is even more important and more difficult to talk about, and that's the dimension called adjustment or neuroticism. And people are either neurotic, which means that they are prone to anxiety, they're prone to depression, they are worriers, they are moody. And on the other hand, we have people who are stable and adjusted. Now, the worrying thing about neurotics is they're worrying. They find it very, very difficult not to be anxious. They're made anxious by failure, they're made anxious by certain situations. We all have stress at work. That's not interesting. Stress at work is true of all of us. The question is, why are some people more stressed than others? And what they try and do about it. Now, if you go to see your clinical psychologist and he or she diagnoses you as being neurotic, there's no magic pill, there's no cure. You can't be made non-neurotic, but you can be taught to cope better, to reinterpret situations, to know what to do when you're very, very anxious. Now, what the psychologists have done, in fact, since the great Greek Galen in the 4th century BC, is come up with 4 types, and we've heard about them: phlegmatic, choleric, sanguine, and melancholic. And these are the 4 types based on these dimensions. So the British are supposed to be phlegmatic, and that is, we are stable as opposed to neurotic introverts, whereas the Americans are sanguine, which are stable extroverts. Maybe the French are melancholic and the Italians choleric. Now, what we do know is that these 2 personality variables are very predictive of success at work, particularly neuroticism, because as you go up the greasy pole, it gets tougher. There's more anxiety. You have to make decisions. The buck stops with you. You have to deal with problems the whole time. You have to confront people. And people who are worrying, anxious, depressed find that very, very, very difficult. And their anxiety and their depression and their hypochondriasis floods them, and they're not that successful. So what you see is that people tend to be much more stable at the top. And they tend to be extroverts because they deal with other individuals. Now the question becomes is, when a person comes into a room, can I detect whether he's a stable introvert or a stable extrovert or whatever? Can I read some of these signals? Well, of course, those people who are neurotic try and hide it. It's not good to have low adjustment, and they try to hide it. But an interview is a stressful situation. A negotiation is a stressful situation. A presentation is a stressful situation. And under those situations, their stress leaks out, and it seriously inhibits their performance. And you can see how anxious they are. It's that trait anxiety that's so problematic. And that is not that difficult to pick up. You can see, I think, the more the stressful situation somebody's in, the easier to see to what extent they're neurotic. They will twitch, there will be verbal indicators of it, their voice might be constrained. All these measures of anxiety are there. Equally, you can see to what extent they're comfortable in situations, they're good with people. So yes, I think non-verbally, you've got quite a good way of picking up these 2 dimensions. But the point you're making is the fundamental one. You've got to understand what the dimensions are. You've got to have the framework. Once you've got the framework, you can say, aha, he's by and large a stable extrovert. She, unfortunately, is a more neurotic introvert. And there are many implications of what they are.
Let's talk a bit about the implications. I mean, I was quite surprised to be reminded that extroverts tend to be more impulsive, for example, and are more accident-prone. So what's fascinating about this personality theory is that you can then go on to make predictions about behaviour where it's not so obvious that there's that much of a connection. And that might be quite helpful in the business environment.
Yes, and that there's always good and bad sides to both. I mean, an introvert will be much more careful, will check things. The extrovert will not. The extrovert will trade off. Let's do it now. It's speed, it's anxiety, it's impulsivity. And that is, as you can see, I'm marginally impulsive, and this is coming through in the way in which I talk, which means I do make errors. I have to have people behind me who check. Extroverts like to talk before they think. They get into trouble by speaking too soon, whereas the introvert will take more time to think about what they want to say. So there are benefits and drawbacks to both. Most people think, oh, it's wonderful to be a strong extrovert. Well, if they look at the data on illnesses, on accidents, on relationships, you'll find that it's not always advantageous to be extroverted. or nor is it disadvantageous to be introverted. Introverts have many virtues. There's indeed a new book, a very popular book that's come out on this particular topic, trying to praise the virtues of the introvert, who have been for too long misunderstood.
Another personality dimension which doesn't get as much attention or is less widely known compared to extroversion and introversion is self-monitoring. It can be high self-monitoring or low self-monitoring. It is actually a profoundly important personality dimension, important to be aware of it, and it has some key implications for body language.
Yes. The essential difference is what the high self-monitor does. The high self-monitor is very aware of the requirements of the situation and requirements of the behavior, my behavior in this situation. So I monitor what's required of me and I perform in that particular way. Whereas the low self-monitor will be themselves more authentically or more naturally. Now again, it's not a good versus bad. The high self-monitors will make much better salespeople, much better customer service agents, because what they're able to do is they're able to put on an act. There's another concept which is called the emotional heart or emotional labour. And the idea is that there are three types of labour. There's cognitive labour, there's intellectual stuff, there's physical labour, and you labour with the heart. When you go into an aircraft, they say, oh, hello, doctor, very nice to see you again, and so forth. And they're putting on an emotional display. It is the requirement of that display. Now, the self-monitor is very good at this. They are aware of how they're coming across, what is required, and the situation that requires this behaviour. Whereas the low self-monitor either doesn't pick it up or won't do it. So, in many ways, the low self-monitor is a much more authentic person. What you see is what you get. Whereas the high self-monitor is able to change their behaviour much more appropriately for the nature of the situation. Now, you can imagine in the world of business, the high self-monitors do better because they're able to be flexible in their particular style. They're able to pick up verbally and non-verbally how people are behaving, and they will mirror the other person's behaviour. They will show the appropriate gestures or whatever, and those will help the interaction.
One of the things I found very interesting in the book was the way you captured the key concept here, and it's about the idea that the high self-monitor person is constantly asking themselves is, what's the best role to play at this precise moment to achieve my goal, and let me play that role. Whereas the low self-monitoring person is asking themselves a completely different question, which is, how can I be more authentically myself?
Yes.
And that seems to also be quite useful as a way of thinking about people when you're dealing with them. Am I dealing with a high self-monitoring person or a low self-monitoring, in terms of working out the progress that the negotiation is going to make as a result?
And you can imagine situations in which the one will be much more preferable than the other. If you're in a clinic, if you're talking to your psychiatrist, you want a low self-monitoring behaviour. What is the person I'm speaking to? What is the real person there? As opposed to somebody who thinks they will put on a particular role. Whereas in a number of customer-facing situations, it's the high self-monitoring behaviour you want. What is expected of me? Can I be that? Am I scripted appropriately?
Now, we've been talking about certain personality dimensions like extroversion, introversion, neuroticism, stability, and high self-monitoring, low self-monitoring. But the world of personality theory, particularly at the popular end, is replete with many other personality descriptions. Yet academic psychologists like yourselves are very suspicious of some of these other labels, particularly the ones that are very popular in the workplace, but seem to have very little academic credibility.
There's a very famous one called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It's probably the most successful of all tests. It's pushed very much, and a lot of consultants use it. The academics are really rather disparaging of it for a number of reasons. First of all, the theory is not loyal to Jung's theory, upon which it's based, and also it divides people into types. Now, you're not short or tall, you have height, and it says you're either an introvert or an extrovert. Now, it misses out on the whole concept of ambivert. So people will say to me, oh, last time I did this test, I was an introvert, now I'm an extrovert. I said, yes, you have 1 point different and you cross the line. But the most important thing, I think, with the test is that it doesn't measure neuroticism. What people are terribly frightened of in the workplace is the measurement of neuroticism. They don't like measuring people's intelligence, but they don't like measuring people's neuroticism or stability or adjustment or whatever, because they find it very, very difficult to give people feedback. More than that, they're very concerned with litigation. So if I said to you, well, I'm very sorry you didn't get the job because you came out rather neurotic and not very bright, they don't like giving this information. And one of the other most worrying aspects of this test is they like to say there are 16 different types, and whatever you are, it's okay. It's fine to be. Well, it's not fine to be some things. It's very problematic if you are a highly neurotic introvert. It provides you and people around you with a number of difficulties which you have to try and confront and you have to try and change. And so what it is, it's an instrument which is designed to make it easy to give people feedback, and to give them, in a sense, I don't think, very rigorous feedback on the dynamics of their behaviour. It's easy to give the feedback, it's easy to play the game. It's different from giving people accurate feedback. If you have to give people feedback on their personality, it is often problematic that there are issues in that, which they often know about. And if you choose a test simply to make it easy and fun, I think you're doing people a disservice.
Let's talk about some of the other personality dimensions that you mentioned, which are particularly helpful in the business world, dealing with other cultures and how cultures vary. Because increasingly today, business is international, and you're going to be dealing with people from another culture. And you're kind of saying in the book that knowing some sense of the personality of the culture you're dealing with is important. So cultures can vary, for example, on individualism and collectivism. Could you explain a bit about what you're getting at there?
It's really the East-West difference. And that you notice that in some cultures we have a problem with teamwork. If you go into the business world, people say, oh, it's terribly important, he's a good team player. Teamwork is very important, and you have to go on courses to become a team worker, because we're not like that. We're very individualistic. We don't get team-related pay, we get individual-related pay. We are taught right from an early age. And my father used to say, love many, trust a few, but always paddle your own canoe. And that is that one is an individualist, and we celebrate the individualism of that. Now, there are other cultures. If you go to Asia, you'll be struck immediately by the way in which people do things in groups. Here in London, you can see a group of Japanese tourists, and they all dress the same and walk together and wear the same badges and so forth, quite happily, because that's the nature of the culture, that they are much more group-oriented. They see the organisation as the family. We see it as a place we go to work. And this can have profound changes, implications for the world of work. I give you an example. I was teaching at the University of Hong Kong, and I said to my students, these are MBA students, well, you know, here's an exercise. If you choose, you can do it in small groups, and you'll get the average mark. Every one of them chose to do it in small groups. They'd say, you speak very good English, you're a good presenter, you live near the library, we'll be a team, and we'll work together, and so forth. I did exactly the same to my English students. Not one chose to, I don't trust you, you're a bit lazy, I will be self-reliant. And we give the message in our culture, a lot of self-reliance, it's up to you. You know, we are captains of our ship and masters of our fate. You as an individual, you take responsibility. It's very much the Western message. It's not the Eastern message in the same way. And that's why, you know, people have some difficulty crossing these two divides. I'll talk about one other dimension, which is in this. It's called power distance. And it's very noticeable in cultures where people are very, very conscious of rank and status in an organisation. Now, some organisations, you'll walk into it and you say, will you be able to tell, just by the way they walk and talk, who are the more senior people? Could you tell at a university? Could you tell the dean from a junior lecturer? Well, they'll be different in age, but can you see other things? Well, some cultures, the Japanese, the Indians, are very, very conscious of rank. They're conscious of rank in society. You'll notice, for instance, there's a huge difference in pay between the top and the bottom. And everything is associated with that rank. Your office space, your demeanour, the Japanese bow is all a function of your rank relative to my rank in society. Whereas others, like the Scandinavians, don't pay much attention to this. That, you know, there's much more a sense of low power distance, that I don't differentiate or discriminate in terms of your rank in the organisation. Yes, I can see there are individual differences, but that's not the important thing. So it can be very difficult for someone who comes from Japan to go to Norway, because he or she is very eager to work out who's more important, who do I have to obey, whereas the Norwegians don't give the signals and don't care in that much. And so you can see all these unfortunate misunderstandings culturally as a function of these dimensions.
A couple of other dimensions you mentioned that are important, which are useful because they're not normally the way we think about other cultures, but one is attitude to time,
yes,
and one is uncertainty avoidance.
Yes. Attitude to time, of course, is very noticeable in some cultures. Rubber time. You know, I say to people, well, you know, if you are asked to come to a meeting at 9 o'clock, what time should you pitch up? If you ask to come to somebody's dinner party and they say come around 8, what time do you pitch up? And we have certain rules for time, and it's thought of as being very rigid and so forth. And you stop for tea and so forth. Whereas other cultures, it's completely different. I was in Africa recently, and I said, what time does the bus come? And they said, well, Tuesday. But what time? No, it comes on Tuesday. You have to be much more flexible. You can walk in and out of meetings. Time is considered quite differently in Germany, which is very, very rigid, very, very demanding of time, as opposed to Spain. The other dimension you talked about, it fascinates me, it's called uncertainty avoidance. We psychologists call it tolerance of ambiguity. And it's all about the discomfort of things not being very, very clear. So here we are in Britain, we don't have a written constitution, and we don't very much care that we have a written constitution. We're happy to muddle along, that's how we make our laws, we muddle along. We're not made uncomfortable by lack of clarity. But in some cultures and in some organizations, it's terribly important to make things very, very standardized. So I recall some email came to me saying, in future, all your slides have to be done in a particular way because that is the way the college want them. Well, nobody's going to pay attention to that sort of nonsense because we come from an organisation which doesn't value this. We are comfortable around uncertainty. The world is an uncertain place. And what people try and do in some cultures is try and they make it orderly and rigid to deal with their anxiety, their intolerance of ambiguity. It's associated with dogmatism, it's associated with authoritarianism. And you can see some cultures are very, very strict about the obeying of some laws. Take, for instance, crossing the road here and with pedestrians. Despite the fact there's little green men and little red men, we don't pay much attention to them. In Germany and America, my goodness, they do. It's a manifestation of this cultural value.
Let's talk now about the chapter on lying and deception and the fact that body language can be really important in getting a handle on how truthful people are being with you. But let's talk first of all about the fact that you emphasise there are different kinds of lying. Because again, the way that most popular books talk about it is as if there's only one kind of lie and they're all terrible. But there are different kinds of lies, and in particular, one of the key things you discuss is emotional lies which involve emotional information as being actually the key area where body language is going to help you in detecting a lie in that particular kind of situation.
There are 5 reasons we find it easier to detect lying. First of all, if you haven't prepared. Secondly, if you're worried that the other person is very skillful, you will know as a psychiatrist that as soon as you say I'm a psychiatrist, people will think, oh my goodness, he's got a third eye, and they will find it more difficult to lie to you. They will also find it's much easier to lie about facts than about emotions. So if I ask you what you had for breakfast, you can easily come up with some cock and bull story, and it'll be easy for you to lie. But if I ask you about your relationship with your children, and you were lying, that's much more difficult. The emotion involved in that. You will see on the television, you'll see people being interviewed of events on wars 50 years ago, and their eyes filling with tears, and them asking, I'm sorry, I can't go on. And there's completely flooded with the emotion. So it's the emotional stuff that comes through, and that people find much more difficult to control. As I say, it's easier to lie about facts. If I ask you what you had for dinner, what was the colour of the room, what was the make of the car, I can easily make that up. But how did you feel about the individual? That is much more problematic, and that's where you get the non-verbals clicking in.
And what I find really interesting about that point is that as a psychiatrist, because obviously in my daily job, I'm used to having to deal with extreme emotions in the person in the session. Yes. But I suspect in the world of finance, a particular kind of person is attracted to that world who steers clear of evoking or provoking strong emotions. Yes. Yet what we're kind of saying is in the world of lie detection, you have to get more comfortable provoking strong emotions because you're going to be in a better position to tell whether someone's deceiving you or not if you do that.
Yes. I think there are, in the world of finance, the only emotion that's really acceptable is anger. You're allowed to throw your toys out of the pram and scream and shout. But what about vulnerability? What about anxiety? What about depression? They are not talked about. They're deeply taboo because people don't know what to do about them. They don't know how to handle them. What do you say if somebody comes to you and say, well, I'm very depressed about all this. It's not part of the nomenclature. It's not part of the everyday conversation. They're not skilled in dealing with it, and therefore it can be hugely problematic. And I'm sure you, as I do, see a lot of people in the city who are very distressed and not allowed to show it. It's an emotion that's unacceptable.
Now, there's a lot of stuff that we've said before is in the literature that's erroneous about lie detection. So people often make mistakes in what they think is the body language to look for, and as a result, people are often very poor at lie detection. All the evidence suggests, in fact, a large number of lies go completely undetected, and that lying or deceiving is actually a large part of our everyday behaviour. So it's kind of key territory. Now, there's some very interesting tips you give here. One is response latency, the time elapsing between the end of a question and the beginning of a response.
It basically says, I ask you a question, and I work out how long it takes you to respond. Because if you give the honest answer, it's usually much quicker. You say, this is what happened. I say, what did happen? And you'll think, well, that's what happened. It takes longer. So you can see it if you watch videotapes, particularly of known lying events. You watch what people do. Frequently they look away because what they're having to do is to think inwards. They're trying to come up with, if they haven't prepared they're trying to come up with a story which takes much longer than if you do it immediately. So response latencies are very, very useful. Again, you'll see it in politicians. Asked a difficult question where they've got to come with a rather devious sort of answer. They have to take time to think about that, and that's easy to measure. Very reliable.
Linguistic distancing. So before we go into linguistic distancing, so response latency means that liars take longer before they actually answer your question, because there's more cognitive work going on to construct the lie.
Compared to the questions where they're telling the truth.
And that goes back to the other point we made earlier about baseline. Important to get a baseline, a comparison, because no one piece of behaviour is pathognomic or highly indicative of lying. It's the contrast between what you do when you're lying compared to when you're not.
Some people are slow. The Archbishop of Canterbury is very slow in giving answers. He's not lying, he's thinking.
Okay. So now, another one you mentioned is linguistic distancing. I find this particularly fascinating, that liars tend not to use personal pronouns, that I, he or she, but talk in the abstract, even when recalling incidents in which he or she was involved.
They sort of make it hypothetical. In those circumstances, wouldn't people naturally do this? They try and take themselves out. They make it as if they weren't there. Whereas often if it's a conversation about what you did, it's I did, she did, they did. And there's a reduction in the use of the I's and the me's and so forth.
And obviously there's a lot of material in the book on this, we can't go into all of it, but a couple of quick things: slow but uneven speech, over-eagerness to fill silences, and too many pitch raises. Can you say anything about any of those?
I'll say a thing. The pitch raise is a funny one. Australians tend to pitch raise. Their voices go up at the end like that, and if you listen to them, that's how they speak. They pitch raise, and the young and adolescents pitch raise. We, by and large, don't pitch raise. But when people start pitch raising, as if, do you believe me now? Is that okay? Yeah, can we move on? And so you get this amazing pitch raise. The slow speech, you'll notice again on television, occasionally someone will be interviewed, and the interviewer will have in his ear or her ear a earpiece where the director is saying something to them. So in the middle of a conversation with you, I can hear somebody talking to me at the moment. And so what I have to do is to really listen to this, so it becomes mechanical. So it's slowing down. It's also called the cocktail party effect, where you hear a conversation over there, which is very interesting, whereas I want to talk to you. And the way I can listen to that conversation is to slow down like that. The other one, of course, is well known, is the famous parapraxis, Freudian slips, where the wrong word comes out. What's fascinating, the evidence suggests that these are better markers of lying than some of the visual ones, because people don't think about them so much. They don't think of the mistakes you make. There's also the nature of the voice, that you can see when somebody is relaxed. My wife can always say, during that interview you were much more relaxed, because of the tone. It's not squeaky, it's not constrained. All these are autonomic nervous system variables which are influencing the behavior, which is visible, and audio, you can hear what's going on.
We mentioned emotion as being important, and another very important point you make in the book is that it's only possible to detect a lie via non-verbal clues if the liar experiences some emotion, such as fear or guilt. And that's quite an important point. In other words, a lot of people can lie successfully because actually they don't really care that much, and they have no emotional involvement. In that situation, it's going to be much more difficult to spot lying.
That's the classic psychopath. Very occasionally, you'll see somebody appearing on television appealing for the murderer. There's been some wonderful cases of women killing their children. And what is surprising is the coolness with which they do it. And if you don't have any guilt, then it's much easier to lie, because there's none of that issues. It's the feelings about lying not only lying about feelings, but the feelings about lying. And if you feel you're in the right, or you feel you don't have, that there's no moral dilemma, it's much, much easier to lie. And that's why psychopaths are so successful, because they're so difficult to detect.
Another important point you make in the book is that it's quite useful to think about the background history of the person telling the lie, in that, is this a lie that they've become practiced at telling, so they're used to telling it. So a used car salesman, for example, I imagine, would be a good example of someone who may be used to lying about the car they're selling, and therefore you're going to find it much more difficult to try and detect a lie in that situation.
Yes. The more novel things are for them, then more these signs will come out. They'll be slower, they'll be more faltering, they'll take longer to think of the idea. Yeah.
And so you should try and create a novel situation, as it were, to spot a lie.
Yes. Now, in the movies, of course, the person has sat there and the light is shined on them, the sort of Gestapo-like interrogation. And in some senses, that is helping the interrogator. It's putting you under a considerable amount of discomfort. The problem with that always is that people mistake anxiety for lying. There are a number of reasons why people could be anxious. In an interview, they're anxious. In a presentation, they're anxious. This is anxiety that comes of their personality in the situation. It's not coming necessarily of them lying. Okay. So putting people under pressure is more likely to make them anxious and hopefully detect the lie. But again, you see anxiety, which is not necessarily the same issue as telling a lie. It's one of the reasons why we have problems with the lie detector. Now, the British Psychological Society and others have strongly recommended that lie detectors are not used, and they're not used because of the false positives and the false negatives. And experimental situations, you know when a person is lying, and you can see whether the machine detects them. The worry is that 10 to 20% of people who are lying are not caught as liars, and the same number, which may be even worse, who are not lying, are thought of as liars. And what the machine is detecting, because it is simply a machine measuring your galvanic skin response and your heart rate and your breathing, is simply showing signs of change in the body. Now, if you're anxious, all these anxiety signs will make the machine move. You're not lying, you're simply anxious. And some people are more anxious about some things in some situations, look as if they're lying, whereas they're not.
Okay, so now let's try and put it all together in terms of particular situations at work, where body language, knowledge, and superior skills are going to be helpful. So one of the things that we often have to do in business is make a presentation or persuade a group of people of something by talking to a group. And of course, this is something that fills many people with anxiety. It's often said to be the most common phobia of public speaking. But body language, as you describe in your book, is extremely important in terms of having an impact and bonding with the audience and persuading them.
Yes. You can see our politicians are taught to do this. The way in which you stand. They will say, first of all, breathe deeply. Make yourself comfortable. Don't speak too fast. If you want to look at brilliant oratory, look at Obama. He is astonishingly brilliant. The way he looks at his audience, the way in which he covers them all, the way in which he smiles, the way in which he holds his hand. You must always, if you make a gesture, you hold the gesture for a period of time. All these are things one can be taught to do. What happens, as you say, with a lot of people is that public speaking is intensely anxiety-provoking, and they get overwhelmed. What most public speaking courses don't do, I think, they teach you about PowerPoint and they teach you about stories. They don't teach you the management of anxiety, the management of your anxiety and the management of their anxiety. You find that some people will always start with a few jokes. Why will they start with a few jokes? To relax the audience, to relax themselves, to see whether the audience think that they're allowed to laugh. You will be told to smile at the audience, spend some time making them feel comfortable. As we've said before, the smile relaxes you. Calm down, speak slowly. A number of these things, mainly to do with the speaking and the body language, which helps you and helps them.
One of the things I found very helpful in this chapter was the notion of a speech or a talk or a presentation as a performance, whereas most of us tend to think of it as just another kind of conversation. Whereas in fact you're saying if you think about it as a performance, for example, you would speak much more slowly,
yes,
and you would tend to use a much more colourful way of speaking. You talk
yes,
about metaphor
yes,
and storytelling, and I found that very helpful. In other words, the notion that it's an act, a performance,
yes,
and
yes,
there should be more emotional flavour in it, and that you're telling a story, you're taking the audience on a journey. A lot of people might find some of that rather intimidating, but you're kind of saying you've got to understand the demands of the task.
Yes. I say to people, what are you going to remember from this conference in 3 weeks' time? I say to my students who come back and see me 10 years later, what do you remember of the course? And you know what they'll remember? 1 or 2 stories. And there'll be emotional stories. There'll be stories which illustrate, what the stories are illustrating the point. And academics and many people think, or CEOs think, yeah, I've got to present the data of the organization, I've got to present the financial implications. So yes, indeed they do, but there's a way of doing it, there's a way in which you can do it with using emotion in your narrative more effectively. And if you look at the great speakers and the great speeches, look at all the great speeches of our time, they've been quite short, they've been very clearly structured, there have been narratives where you have repetition, but they're narratives with a memorable storyline and emotion.
Dramatic, they've been drama has been implicit.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But another key point you make, which again I hadn't thought of properly before, is that most people stand in front of a podium or a lectern or a desk or in front of a microphone and deliver the talk. In fact, you're kind of saying beware of that, because that can really become a barrier between you and the audience.
Yes, yes. You'll see the lecterns get thinner and thinner in politics. Sometimes they're just stands, and sometimes they're made of perspex so you can see through them. But most of the great speakers walk and talk and move. Like Tom Peters, the famous guru, was one who was very dramatic, and he wandered about and he shouted a lot. And it's rather tedious to see only the top part of somebody on a podium. You only get that sort of information. I never personally stand in front of, or behind rather, these things. I move around, they can see me. Now, that means, of course, that they are able to read me much more easily. They can see maybe if I'm anxious or something's not going so well, that they read this information. I think people prefer it. I think these things become barriers, as indeed desks become barriers in interviews. And rooms sometimes now, however well they're set out, are inhibiting the nature of the conversation they're trying to increase. Why do you need a desk? What is the function of the desk? The Freudians would say that the feelings that your genitals are protected. I think it's pretend that they're writing, whereas they're not writing. It's not got that function. It's of historical interest only, but it's not helping the conversation.
But if you're right, then body language is a key part of making a speech or a presentation, as opposed to what most of us tend to think of, which is the words we're using is the key bit. You're actually saying the whole thing is performance. Therefore, body language is vital.
Yeah, absolutely. What you have to do, and I've done this in a few studies, is turn the sound off. So you show people a speech. Say, what's he talking about? How do you know what he's talking about? And you get no verbal cues at all. But you can see, occasionally the camera will pan to the audience, so you can see he or she's making a comment, there's the reaction, what's it all about? And some of them are quite remarkably good, and they're not lip readers, they're looking for how serious is the conversation? When is the most serious part of that conversation? If you take skillful orators, you see how brilliantly they are at doing that.
Let's talk about some other business contexts in which body language is important. Sales, the art of selling. You're kind of saying that body language is crucial there.
Oh yes. And all the salespeople will be taught rigorously what to do. The way in which you only have to go on an aeroplane and see the difference between the body language of people of the people who serve you in first class, business class, or economy. It's very, very different. It's all about the way in which you show respect. Should you touch somebody or not touch? What are the implications? People who know tips. How do you get a better tip? There's, believe it or not, a scientific literature on tipping. If, for instance, I tell you my name, hello, I'm Adrian, I'm your waiter for this evening. If I get crouched down to your height, if I very lightly touch you on the arm, if I smile to you at the beginning, if I apologize for coming a little bit late, if I ask you if you're worried about the time, all these ways increase the tip. Now, salespeople in all industries to know this. If you go to the jewelry business, say, get it on somebody, get the item on the person. If you go into a car salesman, they say, get the person in the car. They will spray smell. They will do a number of things they know, in their small way, cumulatively, influences the likelihood of sales.
What about negotiation?
Yeah.
You're also saying that body language is important in negotiation.
Well, you've got to read where your opponent's coming from. The art of negotiation is, yes, there's a lot of conceptual stuff, there's a lot of analytical stuff about putting your package together and so forth. But what you want to try and detect is how you're getting along with the other individual. We've got to establish a relationship. How well am I getting on that relationship? Suddenly your eye pattern changes. I'm trying to find out what's important to you. There are 4 things on the table. Which is the most important? And I mention them sequentially. At number 3, I notice a change. This is an issue. It's a hot issue. I can then delve into it. So it's about reading where you are coming from. And in negotiation, often we're trying to hide things. We're trying to hide what's most important to us, what's least important to us. That is where the non-verbal perceptiveness becomes so useful.
And there's some fascinating data in the book about the fact that most negotiations involve a concession at some point. And the timing of the concession seems really critical, and depending on the culture you're dealing with.
Yes. Some cultures, concessions are made very quickly, very easily. There's a number of wonderful examples. At the end of the Vietnam War, the Americans and the Vietnamese went to Paris to talk. Well, the Americans hired a hotel for a month, and the Vietnamese hired a chateau for a year. Detected something about their attitude towards time. The Vietnamese insisted for at least a week that the Americans sit at a slightly lower position than them. All these were to intimidate the Americans. I give you another famous example. In some countries, if you go to Japan for a 5-day visit to negotiation or sales, that you do business and then you do pleasure. Having done the business, we then go and play golf. Well, in Japan, it's the other way around. You play golf to find out if I like you, and then we do the business. So it's, let's establish a relationship, let's trust each other, then we do the business. As opposed to the Western model is, we do the business, and then we celebrate having done the business. And that's all with negotiation.
Impression formation is very important in body language, and I want to talk finally a bit about influence, the psychology of influence. Very useful stuff in here about that. But this fascinating experiment you mentioned, where people are served a hot drink, I think a hot cup of coffee, as opposed to the other condition where they're served a cold drink, and that seems to have a significant impact on how much they like you.
Yes, it's called framing. It's well-known social psychological experiment. You can do another one I was reading about just the other day, that people were shown a film about global warming, and they were asked to rate the extent to which they were concerned about global warming. Well, one group sat in a very warm room, one sat in a neutral room, one sat in a cold room, and guess what? The temperature of the room influenced their opinion of the film. And this is the same one. So you say to people, I'm going to offer you a cool drink. I want you to watch this interview while holding this can of whatever it is, some fizzy drink. Or I'm going to offer you a coffee, a warm drink. Well, believe it or not, their rating of the person, that when holding the warm drink, they will think them to be warmer than when holding the cold drink. And it's a well-known framing technique. You can do this. You can frame people with smell, you can frame people with temperature, you can frame people with music. So, for instance, one of my favorite studies of all was a famous study done using music. It was an off-license. And what they do is they piled up French wine and German wine, same type of wine, same type of price, but they played either German music from the week or French music. And of course, when it was French music, they bought more French wine. When it was German music, they bought more German wine. And the idea is, and shops do this, through smell, through light, through music, what they do is they change your mood, and the mood changes the behavior. So I want you to feel Christmassy, I want you to feel nostalgic, I want you to feel excited. So I'll manipulate your mood environmentally, and this mood will have an effect on your behavior.
Well, Adrian, it's a wonderful book, and we've only just touched the surface in terms of all the information that's in here. But to conclude, are there any examples, again, you can think of in terms of your business consultancy work, your very extensive business consultancy work, where you feel that a particular tip or a particular aspect of body language made a difference to people you were dealing with, or an increased awareness of body language seemed to have some kind of practical impact on some of the people that you've been working with, or the advice that you have found most helpful, generally speaking, when dealing with the people you've been working with in business?
Well, I just choose two. One is this business about environmental determinism, and that is when people choose their offices and their buildings, they're often influenced by interior designers and so forth. And interior designers are there for the beauty of the room, the light and the beauty and the elegance, the fashionability. That might be all very well, but that influences the behavior in the room. And sometimes you'll find a room which is elegant, but the elegance is not what you want for the behavior in the room. Now, this is not feng shui. It's a little bit like feng shui. It's not a magical system. It's to say, what is the sort of behaviors you want to do in this room or this space? It doesn't have to be a room. How can we make the room influence the behaviors more optimally? That's one I've noticed. The second one is particularly in this whole business of negotiation. You know, people negotiate, or you negotiate with your children, you negotiate with your spouse. It is the reason why it's probably the most popular of all the courses that people elect to do. And it's really about being aware of what signals you're sending and how you can dress, how you can behave, how you can sit, how you can not show certain things. It's the poker hand, as it were. And how at the same time you can pick up them. Now, I don't think this is necessarily being deceptive. I think it's being a good negotiator. It's making them self-aware and other-aware. And that, to a large extent, is done through body language, which is why video cameras are so useful in training. You simply show people what they look like and say, can you change that? Is that what you want to look like? What do you need to do to change it? Change that behavior. That will make you come across differently. Now let's look at them again. What are they saying to you? What does this mean? And to make them self-aware, that can have a very significant difference in negotiation, which is terribly important in business.
And that reminds me of another very powerful bit of social psychology, in my opinion, very underrated, which you've alluded to, which is that get people to make a small concession or a small commitment, like wearing a small badge in support of a local charity, and you're much more likely to get a bigger commitment later on. And I think that's a fascinating bit of influential psychology.
Yeah, it's reciprocity. Have you noticed that charities will give you small gifts? You'll get a letter, it'll be some stickers or a cheap pen or something like that. They know that the investment of a very, very small amount of money will increase the probability of people giving to buy 13, 14%. It's very profound in our culture. I buy you a drink, you buy me a drink. I do you a favour, you do me a favour. So I do you a small favour and you repay that favour. Reciprocity.
But I think it's also about a lot of other very fascinating psychology, which is about identity theory, which is that if you make a small donation to a charity, your identity now is one of a person who supports that charity.
Yes.
That means that if the charity comes back and asks you for much more money later on, you're more likely to donate. And that's about consistency and about dissonance, that we like to see ourselves as consistent people. Absolutely. So I think there's a lot of very powerful psychology that's often a bit underrated in that.
Absolutely. There's a very important book by a man called Cialdini, and he argues there are only 6 powerful influence techniques, and you've mentioned already one of them, or 2 of them. Consistency. That is why I went into a car sales room the other day. What was the question that the man asked me? What was the first question? I asked people that, what did they ask you? How much you've got to spend? No. He said, sir, is the safety of your family the most important thing for you at this time? What can you say? No? It's all, yes, I said. This car, sir, is the safest car on the road. Consistency. He got me to say what was important to me, and then he gave me the product. All these people know that. Another one, of course, is one you mentioned, reciprocity. There's also scarcity, closing down sales. I have been going down the same road in London for 23 years. On that road, there's a shop having its consistent end of sales, closing down sales. It's been closing down for 23 years. It's not been closing down at all, but it makes products scarce. And things that are scarce are attractive. And this man has come up with these 6 very profound principles of influence, some of which can be powerfully changed by nonverbal behaviour.
Adrian Furnham, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.